Chinese mobilized forces disregarding the confidence building measures that we have agreed to. And despite the Wuhan and Chennai connect between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, one of the keys to success in China is management. I think India needs to learn the managerial skills. In China, they work for 16, 17 hours a day at a pretty low cost. I think we need to learn from this. We need to do some reverse brain drain that IITs generally experience.
Welcome to another episode. Today we have a very special guest with us, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli. He is Dean of School of International Studies at JNU, an expert of Chinese studies and esteemed author. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much to be on board.
You have a lot of experience with your academics with Chinese studies. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word China?
A lot of cultural feelings that they have a huge 4,000-5,000 of civilizational background, historical background, but also a lot of similarities with India and Indian culture and so on. Second is, of course, we are at the same level of development. China is more advanced. With $19 trillion, we are at $3.6 trillion of GDP, but essentially at the society level, culture level, we are almost at the same level.
There was a stage when India's GDP was at par with Chinese GDP. Now it's more than double as the GDP of India.
Yeah, till about 1980s, Indian and Chinese GDP are similar. Slightly, China is at an advantageous position. But now currently there is a huge gap that has emerged in HRD, in economy, in other military or other indicators. So China is, for the sake of statistics, $19.6 trillion GDP. India is about $3.6 trillion of GDP. So China is the second largest, while India is the fifth largest economy in the world. HRD wise, the Chinese have over 90% literacy rate. We have about 80% and above literacy rate. They have a life expectancy beyond 97, 96 years. We have life expectancy around in the 80s, 84, 85 something. Also in terms of other infrastructure projects like internet penetration, railways, roads, infrastructure projects, they are more advanced in nature, although India is also picking up now. We are, for example, laying down 27 kilometers of roads a day. Education-wise, literacy rate-wise, infant mortality-wise, we are reaching those stages, universal stages, as we implement the United Nations-led SDGs, Sustainable Development Indicators. The pace is picking up in India as well now for the past decade or so, with economic growth rates higher. On the other hand, the Chinese economic growth rates are falling to 3.3% last year. And this year they expect that to go up to about 5.5%. And we are expecting 8.7% growth rate this year for us. So it's a mixed bag on the India-China GDP and social indicators. They have an advantage right now because they invested heavily in these sectors. We're now looking at these more prominently. There are differences. The Chinese spend more on vocational education. We spend more on higher education like JNU. And since 1980s, the Chinese economic growth rates picked up. And in 1 year, they had 14% growth rate, somewhere in 94, 95. But then fallen to about 10% by 2010 and about 3.3% last year. So they became $19.6 trillion GDP country over a period of time. And I think this is mainly because there is a change in leadership in China towards a more reformist oriented compared to an ideologically driven Maoist period. Secondly, the Americans helped China to rise in the international system. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's visit These were some of the contributing factors. And in 1979, Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China, went to the White House and they cobbled up three main aspects, which is one among them is Americans guaranteeing the China rise with huge investments and technology transfer and market opening up. For example, there are 77,000 American companies in China. There are roughly about 1,000 companies in India, American companies. So that's the scale of American involvement in China. There are about 83,000 Japanese companies in China compared to about 1,300 in India. Despite all the talk about strategic partnership between India and Japan, just about 1,300 companies in India. So the kind of technology transfer, the kind of investment that were made in China is mind-boggling. They were receiving $60 to $65 billion a year, and a cumulative amount of nearly $12 to $13 trillion so far of investments, FDI, into China. That created a world-class infrastructure, that created the export orientation. So much so today, China's exports and imports constitute nearly 40% of their GDP. They have about $4 trillion of exports and imports. We have just about $1.1 trillion exports and imports last year. So there is a huge qualitative transformation done with the American blessing, and they wanted to basically counter the Soviet Union, and also the support given to China is tremendous
by the US,
by the United States. Since United States is the superpower, the signals also affected their allies like the NATO partners like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, who all invested in China. So the signaling was very important. Of course, today China is moving away from the United States in terms of this decoupling process or de-risking process. So there is a huge reevaluation of their priorities now since the 19th Communist Party Congress held in 2017, where they mentioned that they want to move towards the center stage. Okay. They want to occupy the center stage, which basically means that China today is questioning the US leadership in many areas, in BRICS, in SEO, in Security Council of the United Nations Security Council, and other avenues. So just to summarize this, the American blessings were important for China's rise. However, today, since late Trump administration, there is a tariff war, and there is followed by the Chinese themselves saying that they want to now go for the #1 position in the world. So that has created a lot of tension across the globe. And in the neighborhood, China is asserting. China is, for example, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, India-China border areas. These are the areas where China is now exerting as a result of its rise recently.
What kind of ideology does China cater to? You know, they're a communist nation, for instance, but they also, trying to be a capitalist one since the investment from the US in 1939. So what do you think? What kind of approach do they take in terms of doing business around the world?
I was struck with the headline the People's Daily carried roughly in the 1980s, early 1980s. Capitalism is communism. That was the slogan that People's Daily carried. People's Daily, as you know, is the Central Committee Propaganda Department of the Communist Party's mouthpiece. They actually call it mouthpiece unabashedly, and they also call this as propaganda department. Of course, they are now trying to tweak by saying this is publicity department, but like in Soviet practices and propaganda department, it's a pejorative term. Communist Party today is controlling the market economy in China. Chinese economy is free in general. They have some 60% of the GDP run by the private enterprises. So quite a huge number.
Is it?
About $10 trillion worth production is done by the private sector in China, out of $19 trillion. And the private sector is guaranteed under the Constitution, 1992 Constitution, with security provisions for their investments, and they also have freedom of religion, except that if you question the Communist Party, then things would be different. Otherwise, they have a lot of freedoms across China, and that has created the structure for the private enterprises to grow. The catch is, of course, the private enterprises also have a Communist Party cell. For example, Huawei or Alibaba or Chongqing, the telecom giant, or Meituan, a food delivery, IT company, or you pick up any private enterprise in China, they have, if they employ more than 6 people, then they should have a Communist Party cell.
Is it?
And anybody who is now inviting private enterprises, they all have a Communist Party cell. Of course, this Communist Party cell head is not speaking Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, or other attendant ideological terms. They're purely into business, but they also, in a way, communicate to the Central Committee about their requirements. So they exert pressure on the Central Committee and the Communist Party leaders. But it also goes the other way. Communist Party can also put pressure on the private enterprises in China. China has implemented the reform and opening up, and private enterprises today play a big role in their GDP. Yet the Communist Party controls this capitalism. Capitalism essentially defined as private sector, private ownership. It is all there in China. People own land. Unlike in India, of course, they do not own in the sense that we own land,
Right.
but they can transfer that land to their children, grandchildren, and so on and so forth. They have a lease of
More
80 to
lease.
90 years on that piece of land, or an apartment, or land in urban areas. The 92 Constitution guarantees all of those private ownership and protects that under law. So you can go to the court if anybody violates, including the state violates their
Is it?
private ownership. So essentially it is capitalist from this point of view, but Communist Party is at the head of all that.
Okay.
Communist Party is the most decisive element under the 4 cardinal principles of Deng Xiaoping. And as a result, we saw Jack Ma, the head of the Alibaba, running around. He is now in Japan. He was previously in Bangkok. He was running around because he made a statement about the banking system controlled by the state that is not able to provide them with credit for the private enterprises. So he was criticized. He was almost in house arrest, isolation, and he almost fled the country. He is $54 billion worth company head,
Yeah.
and all his shares went down. The IPOs, etc., were restricted by the Chinese government. Today, he himself is in Tokyo, in Japan, running away from China. So it's a dichotomy that while China is becoming more private, enterprise oriented, capitalist oriented, but it is the Communist Party which is the mover and shaker in China.
They are always, under the radar of the Communist Party. Would you call it a dictatorship?
Biden recently, last month, called Xi Jinping as a dictator. And this created a lot of concern in China, because United States signals are very important at the global level. The Chinese have also changed their tack on ideological aspects. They do not now get involved in democracy versus communism, because Chinese communism is also kind of diluted with individual freedoms and especially property, religion, and others. So they move further than classical Marxist communist society, but you still have a lot of authoritarian structures. Because they have freedom, today ordinary Chinese can go anywhere, freedom of movement. They have freedom of speech, but not in writing. They can speak, but cannot circulate around. If they circulate, they have to face the wrath of the police and other authoritative structures. For example, in Galwan, when 20 Indian soldiers were killed, the Chinese leadership took 8 months to reveal that there were 4 Chinese casualties. On the other hand, 4 Chinese journalists questioned this figure on the limited casualties in Galwan, and all of them were arrested. There was one lady journalist who went abroad and they chased her in Dubai. She was going in Dubai airport and they picked her up and bumped her off. So that is authoritarian. Not yet a dictator, because there is individual freedoms, especially property, as I just mentioned, and they can assemble not more than 2 or 3, but they can go around, travel around. Dictatorship is a little bit stronger for China. We can say this for North Korea.
Yeah.
But in the case of China, there are economic freedoms. You can set up a shop, you can study what you want to, you can believe in Christianity or Confucianism or Buddhism or Taoism or other religions.
You can get your education abroad as well.
You can get your education abroad. There are over 2 million Chinese studying in US before the curbs have begun under the Trump administration. So there are quite a few freedoms that Chinese enjoy. So it is not exactly a dictatorship, but it is an authoritarian government whose diktats still have to be followed. So it is quite complex in nature. On the other hand, there are in the villages elections. Villages can choose. There are about 8,800,000 villages who elect their leader, the sarpanch. These are relatively fair. I went and watched one of the village elections. Relatively fair, like what happens in India. But the Communist Party is not based at the village. It is based at the county level. That is something like our tehsil level. And so they were experimenting with this democracy at village level, but village level is not the main administrative mechanism. So they are safe, because what happens in the village level is that a leader gets elected. Mainly recently, wealthy families are getting elected, wealthy family representatives. On the other hand, once he or she gets elected, they become Communist Party members. Because Communist Party decides on your mobility, on your promotions. So it's a nuanced way of looking at. Definitely not a dictatorship in the classical sense that we saw in the Soviet Union before. Those were highly centralized. But in the case of China, there is a huge decentralization that has happened, especially in the economic field.
So earlier you mentioned for the last couple of years, China's GDP is going down. What could be the main reason towards that? Is it COVID-19 or any other reason that is, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war that's ongoing? What is the main reasons for the downfall of the GDP in the last couple of years?
In general, if you're growing for 30 years, there is always a chance for decline.
Right.
Even if they are firing on all cylinders, it's difficult to maintain that growth rate. Many countries have fallen. Japan, for example, they had lost a decade in the 1990s. And even now, the Japanese growth rates are very low. And of course, the Japanese moved into China. Their industry, S&T, management, everything else has been moved into China. So there is this hollowing out process in Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, towards the Chinese market. Wherever the labor charges are high, the capital tends to move away. And the capital charges are very high. Labor charges are very high in Japan, South Korea at the time in the 1990s, so they moved into the China market. Today, China labor wage is high, so they're moving to South Asia and Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam, Indonesia, India.
Right.
Many of these companies are relocating. For example, Foxconn almost is shutting down in Changzhou and shifting to Pune for its iPhone manufacturing for the Apple company. So this is a universal trend where the labor wages are high. They want to make more profits, and so cutting down on every other area, including in the labor wages. So if that is not possible, then they move on to a next market, which is India, Vietnam, Indonesia, or others. So this is a natural trend. So this is one factor. The second factor is, of course, the Chinese GDP was mainly based on export oriented.
Right.
And since the global financial crisis, we have seen that there is many countries have now reduced the domestic consumption, which means less imports from countries like China. There is also the factor of limitations in export orientation. You always have to be one step ahead and possibly compromise on your labor management and others in this process of chasing higher growth rates. So this is another factor which sometimes creates a decline in GDP figures. Third is that domestic consumption is very low as a result of external export oriented economy, SEZs and others. So as a result, there is a continuous pressure on China. The decoupling process with the United States, you have also the protectionist trends. China market itself is a protectionist market. For example, Indian pharmaceutical companies are not allowed in China market. Indian software packages are not allowed in China market. So it is protectionist, but they found some loopholes in the World Trade Organization and other trading mechanisms, and so they are dumping goods in the third markets, in the other markets. So as a result, we see there is a limitation for this growth, both at the domestic level as well as the external level. Chinese economy is highly integrated before. Now they want to also restructure their domestic economy. So during 13th five-year plan, 14th five-year plan, they now are tweaking their economic structure for more domestic consumption, more imports rather than exports, and they want to raise the per capita income of the people as a part of the effort to overcome the middle income trap. So as a result of all of this, there is with the restructuring, you could face the problem of decline in growth rates. That is structured, because when you shift from one economic model to the other economic model, there is some turbulence, and turbulence is reflected in the GDP, gross domestic product. So those are some reasons which could explain the GDP decline.
So there's been a lot of talks about the change in the geopolitical power and the change in the world order from the west to the east. How is China involved in that?
Yes, there is, for example, we saw G7 decline in terms of their investments, trade, and other figures. On the other hand, G7 became G20, accommodating other rising economies like China, India, Indonesia, or other countries. It's a change, it's a statement saying that G7 is no more supreme in economic affairs. Obviously, China is the second largest economy and India fifth largest economy. And it would be a surprise if G7 has stuck to its guns, because there are other rising countries reflected in the BRICS countries. Although in BRICS countries, every other country's growth rates are declining except for India in the BRICS. G7 is not able to address those issues, and so they are now expanding the club to become G20, and G20 is now getting expanded further with possibly African Union as a member in the next summit. So that is the main format.
Earlier, you spoke about the similarities of India from China. What are the key learnings for us in how can we improve our functioning as a government, as a nation, and achieve the kind of growth that China has been achieving in the map of geopolitics?
One of the keys to success in China is management. I think India needs to learn the managerial skills. For example, like the Japanese, Korean, the Chinese also have huge labor management practices. In India, for every move, you have a dharna, you have a shutdown, you have a lockdown. In China, Communist Party guaranteed that the labor unions do not cross the line and disrupt the production capacities. So this is one I think we need to learn. In India, the first thing that happens is all banks are on strike. You have finance related problem that day. And all trade unions are up in arms for some reform measure, like say demonetization, the GST, or other tranche of reforms that have been conducted. So I think there is space for management generally of production capacities and so on. The labor itself is part of the management, and they are the stakeholders in your profits or losses. So that kind of a system is what India needs to look at, number one. Number two, the per capita productivity is very high. In China, they work for 16, 17 hours a day at a pretty low cost. I'm not suggesting India should learn from this. We are a democracy, so we have to go through the parliamentary system and evolve policies. But per capita productivity, we should not compromise on. How do we do it? Increase the productivity levels by following the democratic principles. In Shenzhen, in Zhuhai, in other areas, the Chinese government, they force the people to work for 16, 17 hours a day, giving them hardly 30 minutes lunch break and 3-4 hours of sleeping in the night. Other than that, they have no freedoms. We cannot adopt this model because our system is different, ours is democratic. But per capita productivity, we need to learn from China. By implementing the democratic principles, we need to see how we can tweak with this, because our productivity is very low, and that is what we need to do in this context. The third area where we can learn from is in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, they followed a keeping a low profile policy, and that was quite successful in terms of their economic growth rates. I think India also needs to tone down the security related issues. Of course, I'm not suggesting we compromise on our sovereignty and territorial integrity, but we need to scale down the security aspects, emphasize on economic development.
Right.
For the time being, we need to enhance our GDP, per capita income, social welfare of the people. Simultaneously, of course, we need to strengthen our defenses. So we need to do some tightrope walking on this issue of security and development. I think we are doing good on that front, despite provocations from Pakistan and China. So that is a third measure that we can implement. There are various others. For example, the infrastructure development. They have utilized the FDI and savings from their own domestic market in order to create a world-class infrastructure that India needs to learn from. So they send thousands, hundreds of thousands of students abroad, and they trained them and invited them back, provided incentives under the 1,000 Grains project. So they provided incentives to the students who went abroad and given them laboratories, given them space, given them higher incentives like salary, project money, and so on and so forth, and created a lot of patents, which is useful in the knowledge economy and others. So this is one I think India needs to, with Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, we need to also include the returned students, the NRI returned students. Fourth area is their obsession with the GDP and obsession with S&T and others. So this obsession today has created a world-class S&T base in China. I think we need to learn from this. We need to do some reverse brain drain that IITs generally experience.
So the Indo-China relationship has had a rocky patch in the past. They've got financial issues, they've got border issues. What do you think is the future of our relationship with China is going towards? Because I feel the growth is interconnected of both China and India because they're up against US, for instance. Where do you think the relationship is going to in the future?
Galwan is a major marker in the India-China relations. On June 15, 2020 night, 20 Indian soldiers were killed by the Chinese troops, and they declared after some time about 4 casualties on their side. This could have been avoided. The Chinese mobilized forces disregarding the confidence building measures that we have agreed to, and despite the Wuhan and Chennai connect between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. So India felt betrayed by China during Galwan conflict. Even today, the Chinese have not withdrawn from the areas that they have occupied in Depsang Plains and at Demchok. So this indicates that China had something up its sleeve on Indian disputed lands with China. Despite the fact that the 93 agreement mentions about war is not an instrument for resolving the territorial dispute, there is a heavy mobilization by China and India. So this has created a big red line in the India-China relations. So I think last 3 years has been the worst situation in the India-China context after the 1962 war. How do we get out of this stalemate on the borders? Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, mentioned on June 17th night, 2 days after the Galwan incident, that unless until peace and tranquility prevails on the border, we will not have any bilateral relations. So that suggests then that we need to stabilize the borders first. Multilateral interactions have not been affected because bilateral relations are stuck today, and there is a certain red line that has been created. It appears today the BRICS meeting in Johannesburg in South Africa, the 15th meeting, doesn't include, as of now, the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping.
Is it?
As of now, we have not got any indicators of that sort. And so we should expect the strain in relations to continue for some time to come, despite 19 core commander level meetings. So India-China relations are at a very low level. No bilateral relations as of now. As Dr. Jaishankar mentioned, the bilateral relations are abnormal in nature. So this is quite a bad news for them.
What about we are going to be hosting G20, the presidency, and expecting a lot of global leaders later this month. Do you think we will have a forum to discuss about Indo-China relation with China?
As I mentioned, the restriction is in the bilateral relations, but not in the multilateral.
Okay.
So G20 being a multilateral institution, there probably will be discussions. As the Foreign Affairs Commission Director Wang Yi met with National Security Advisor Mr. Ajit Doval in South Africa last month. Also, Dr. Jaishankar met with Wang Yi, and before that, Dr. Jaishankar met with Chin Kang, the previous foreign minister, and General Li Shangfu, the defense minister, met with Rajnath Singh. So since India hosted the SEO and G20, there are discussions and Chinese have participated in these. Since it is not bilateral, so there is no restriction on the multilateral interactions. So there is a bifurcation in the relations between the two.
There's been a lot of speculations that the BRICS are going to be inculcating a new currency in order to do trade. What is your take on that, sir?
There has been some news about this recently that de-dollarization could result in the trading in local currencies. And there is an effort and a push for this, but I'm not sure whether they will come out with a statement regarding this because there are huge differences. Russia and China seems to be closer on that issue, and their trade of $120 billion, a part of that, a major portion of that is in renminbi ruble exchanges. But when you look at India-China trade of $125 billion, it's mostly in the US dollar, not in renminbi rupee trade. Likewise, Brazil-China trade, likewise South Africa-China trade, or South Africa-Russia, South Africa-India, all this is conducted in the US dollar. So the de-dollarization, generally we saw the debates in China or in Russia, they have limited appeal as of now. When you look at the global exchanges, majority of these are done in US dollar.
Right. Something
like 46% or so, about nearly 50%. Half of the global trade is conducted in US dollar terms. Renminbi is about 2 to 3% as of now, and if they have luck in trading, they may reach probably 5 or 6%. British pound, euro, Japanese yen, they have a higher standing, 20% odd, something of that sort. So it's a tall order for renminbi to replace the US dollar. It is a tall order for the BRICS to agree for transactions in local currencies because they are connected to the US dollar in a prominent manner. This debate has gone forward because the SWIFT system has been banned for the Russians. Also, there were several sanctions on Russia after the Ukrainian conflict. So this debate has increased in pace, but ground reality is that a majority of countries are still dependent on the US dollar.
Right.
So we may probably see after a decade or two some incremental change that can happen.
So you're currently working on a book which talks about AI, artificial intelligence. Where do you see India and China coping with the technological advancements that are happening in the rest of the world, the globe?
Chinese have a Made in China 2025 campaign in which they have identified AI, Internet of Things, 3D printing, automation, nanotechnology, and a host of other initiatives. Among them, AI is a major component, and this has resulted in huge investments in the AI and 5G technologies, and they are moving also in the space direction. When you look at their programs, the 13th Five-Year Plan, 14th Five-Year Plan, 14th Five-Year Plan, for example, indicates that they want to become a superpower in AI and quantum computing. And they have launched also missions satellites for quantum technologies, critical technologies. So they're making a lot of advances. However, much of this is dependent on the US trade and commerce and technology transfers. Last October, the Biden administration imposed a $130 billion sanctions on or semiconductor ban on China, which is affecting Huawei, ZTE, and other companies. So there is now a gaping hole in China's ambition to be the AI superpower. In terms of big data, supercomputing, they made major strides, but the dependence on the US and Europe and Japan, Korea That is leading to some concerns because increasingly we see some decoupling process or de-risking process. India is also now emphasizing on AI for health, for social sector, especially during COVID times. We also in defense related, civilian technologies related, AI is being extensively used for educational purposes, for remote areas, for medical help in remote areas. Drone technology is being used extensively in this format as well, especially during the COVID pandemic, as there was the transport restrictions or physical restrictions. So we used a lot of these drones for health related sectors. India and China, they have their own AI programs. The Chinese want to control so they have a concept called internet sovereignty, that whatever is in their territory, on their territory in the electromagnetic spectrum, they say that they have a sovereignty over that.
Okay.
So they control the internet. But being a democracy, India cannot control the internet, except for, say, security purposes or counter-terrorism purposes. Being a democracy, it is difficult for India to adopt the Chinese model on AI and others. And this has created some differences between India and China. Not just China, but even Russia wants to curb the internet. So there is a divergence between Russia, China on the one hand, and the other BRICS partners in introducing the internet sovereignty related matters. So it's a complex issue, political issue as well. And the other is imposing standards on chips, on various other quality indicators. Even on this, there is some difference between India and China on the AI related matters.
So today marks a crucial day in terms of India and its research in terms of outer space. We are due to land on the South Pole of the Moon. What do you think about the technology that we use, and how did we do better than Russia? That Russia's spacecraft was crashed 2 days back, and the infrastructure that they had developed. And how do you see India doing well in that sphere?
I think the Mars mission that we conducted before, the 100 and odd satellites that we launched, recovery vehicles, other spacefaring efforts that we made, I think that has really, and this is mostly indigenous in nature in terms of our technologies. And there is the US negative attitude towards the Indian space program before on cryogenic engines that we plan to get from Russia. Likewise, the Chinese also have a negative view on the cryogenic engines transfer from from Russia to India. Despite this, India made major strides in this space program. We're almost at par with China on this, except that the manned spacecraft has already been conducted by China. The taikonauts that they launched is one area where they have an advantage. They also have Peito series of global positioning system satellites, some 54 odd satellites to be launched. Majority of them have already been launched by China, which provides much more accurate weather forecasting or even cartography, surveillance or other measures. We have the INSAS, INSS program, but focused mainly on India and Indian Ocean region. The Chinese system is acquiring global proportions. So that way they are more advanced. And finally, they also have the quantum computing, quantum technologies satellites, which is more advanced than India. But these are going on different tracks, Indian development, Chinese development. We have an MOU on space cooperation, but it never really realized because of the other geopolitical issues like territorial dispute or other issues. Having said that, the ISRO had signed some agreements with the Chinese apps, IT apps, despite their ban. And With Xiaomi or other companies, we have had some agreements. So limited cooperation in the space program, but nevertheless, we are going in two different tracks. Space is used for launches. Who will launch at a cheaper rate, inexpensive rate? That is one. Who can provide more services, telecom and other services. Space weaponization, the ASAT test, anti-satellite tests, which also creates a kind of friction because the Chinese have done an ASAT in 2007. We recently, about a year ago, we conducted an ASAT test. So space weaponization or militarization is another aspect where there is an increasing focus. But in terms of using space for civilian applications, both countries are making several advances. Education, weather forecasting, healthcare, there is an increasing pressure on both India and China because we are hugely populated, 1.4 billion each. So which means how do you cater for the social sector is becoming a major issue, and that's where there is probably some exchange of ideas. But as of now, the cooperation has been very limited in nature in space program between China and India.
So after hearing you speak on various subjects or on India-China relations, I see that there's a lot of the future of India's growth is very promising. What do you think about that, and are you hopeful for India's growth in the terms of the world map?
Absolutely. I think the fundamentals of India are quite good. We have a 400 million middle class who consume a lot of things like automobiles, textiles, everything else, consumer durables. So what that means is our growth rates can be sustained over a period of time because of this. Number two is average age of Indians is 26 years. Average age of Chinese is 36 years, and aging is catching up with many East Asian countries, including China. So 26 years old mean that if the leadership is providing tools, training, skills, and so on, we can sustain these growth rates for over a long period of time because of this demographic dividend. The third is we have a stock exchange which is 150 years old. So there is the speculation, the business in the veins of people in Maharashtra, in Mumbai, in Gujarat. It's in their blood to speculate and create wealth, create value. When you compare with global stocks, India is prominently the most important one in terms of capitalization. A fourth one is the English speaking mostly in India. It provides an advantage, negotiation style and others. A fifth advantage that India has is it's geopolitically well located in the Indian Ocean. We have no conflicts across. We had just the Mumbai attacks, terrorism. We don't have any major conflict. When you look at, reverse the map of India, the peninsula jets into the Indian Ocean. When you look at, except for Digu Garcia, there is nothing that is visible. Now, of course, Hambantota under the Chinese. When you look at Chinese map, reverse towards the sea, you have US bases, Vietnam, Philippines. China is constrained, but India is not constrained when you look at the Indian Ocean region. The other features are that the private sector is quite prominent in India. They have done a lot of mergers and acquisitions. The Tatas acquiring Jaguar, Rolls-Royce, engines coming into India. The kind of benign image that we have with many companies from the US, Europe coming and investing in India increasingly recently. And finally, of course, the soft power itself. You go to Afghanistan, go at 6 p.m. To any house, they're all hooked on to this Kabhi Saas Bhi Bahu Thi, kind of serials. So attentive that they would not even entertain you during those hours when they are hooked on to this TV. And it is a major crowd puller, the Bollywood movies and yoga and others. I think there are very many fundamental things that India has to look at future in a more robust, positive manner. 60-70% of silicon is from India, Indian origin. That also provides a lot of, if the Indian government recalls them, provides incentive for them, you can see a qualitative jump in the Indian technological prowess. So I see a very positive, encouraging picture for India in the coming years.
That's lovely to hear, sir. So I've come to an understanding that I could sit with you the entire day and I wouldn't have questions stop. Like I will continue asking you questions. So before we wrap things, sir, can I request you to say you have published a few books with Pentagon Press, about over 10 books, sir. Do you have any things to say about Pentagon Press and how your journey has been with us?
Thank you very much. I think Pentagon really has given me an opportunity to express our opinions. We have been mobilizing several researchers here, and Pentagon has been able to accommodate us in reaching out to the wider audience. And Pentagon has also transformed itself from national security to even across the spectrum towards the culture, children, and other major, platforms, subjects. Secondly, Pentagon transformed itself from being a local to a global publishing house. Pentagon also has now a variety of subjects that are being published across the spectrum. I think that is good in terms of expanding the base of the viewers, patrons, and readers. I think Pentagon also has reached out to the global markets. I see that Pentagon has been listed in several book exhibitions across the world, in UK, in other places. So this is, I think, fantastic. I wish the Pentagon the much more successes
Thank you so much,
in the
sir.
near future.
Thank you so much, sir. We really appreciate your support and partnership, as in, we really appreciate you. So before we go, can I request you sign me a copy of your latest book on China, COVID-19 in China?
Sure.
Beautiful, sir. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Until then, keep reimagining yourself and know that the power of change lies within you.